Jesus calms the storm. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
Right, I think we've got a slide to go up on the wall. We're working our way through Mark's Gospel this half term, and we're at the beginning of a new block today, a new little section, which very handily fits into the month of July. And we're into those sort of four areas there listed under number one. We've been confronted really from the very beginning of Mark's Gospel with the power and the authority of Jesus. I know Susan sort of picked up those themes in her prayers. We've seen incredible healings. We've seen Simon's mother-in-law and the fever sort of just leaving her as Jesus helps her up. We've seen leprosy disappear from a man's skin. We've seen a paralysed man regain the use of his legs, and all of those things we've been sort of amazed at, as the crowds are actually in Mark. But we're now moving into what I can only describe as a spectacular section. It's probably not a very good example, but if any of you have enjoyed the TV series Stranger Things, which our kids did, and so I got sort of sucked into that with them and watched it sort of series by series. Then heard the news that there was a show in the West End on the stage under the same name, Stranger Things, a prequel to the television series. And I've loved shows right from like being at school. I used to love the sort of the year 6 thing. I never really took part. It was not my thing. I was too busy with a bat and a ball. But I used to love watching it. And then in secondary school, every year, the 5th years, the year 11, would do an end-of-year show, often a musical, but I loved it. And so any excuse now to go to the theatre, to see something, is just something I love. And seen, as I'm sure many have here, some amazing things. But I sat there in Stranger Things feeling like I feel like I've never seen anything like this. In terms of the technology, the way that everything's done, the way that they lift you and almost put you in one of the TV episodes. And I probably bored people afterwards talking about how amazing it was. I was just jaw-dropping. And that is the sense as we come from Mark 4:35 to the end of chapter 5. We are now, this is now jaw-dropping territory. We see Jesus, in fact, first of all, we see this world kind of in microcosm. We see nature out of control. We see evil out of control in chapter 5. We see a sickness that has dogged a life for 12 years relentlessly, sickness out of control. And then finally we see a man, Jairus, who receives the news that his daughter has died. So we have this fallen world, and the Bible at different times uses all sorts of different language to describe it. I've put there the reign of decay, life outside of Eden. This is a post-Eden world. The perfection of creation in chapters 1 and 2 of the Bible suddenly replaced, as it were, by a fallen creation, a post-Eden world. The Bible uses all sorts of language to describe Satan, or in Genesis 3, the serpent. He's described sometimes as the God of this age, God with a little g, or the prince of this world. We hear about the realm of sin and death. All of these descriptions, that's the sort of the picture, if you like, for this next block in Mark 4 and 5. And we see, secondly, Jesus coming into the picture, coming into the world, post-Eden world. the realm of sin and death, the realm where supposedly the God of this age reigns, or the prince of this world has some kind of authority or role. And we see Jesus walking, as it were, onto the stage in Mark 4 and 5 with absolute control in every area in this block of 4. We see his care for the individuals caught up in these 4 scenarios. We literally see the king that we sang about at the beginning, all creatures of our God and King, on bended knee before God's king. We see God's king walking into this realm. And in a sense, we see in these 4 incidents his kingdom, and we see his rule, and we see the future of his kingdom. And Mark, throughout the 4 incidents, is going to bring before us this idea of fear and faith, the reactions of the people in the different situations, and we're going to see Mark developing this theme as we go on. So let's just go to the next slide, just 3 this morning, and what we begin to see as we look into the storm. And of course, for many of us, I hope you haven't switched off. For many of us, we've heard of this, we know it inside out, but just suspend that for a little bit and let's look at some of the details. We see fear beginning to take hold in this situation. One of the things we shouldn't miss about this, as Jemima read it, was the amount of detail that really can only have come about with eyewitnesses. Verse 35, just have a glance down, verse 35, it was Jesus' idea to get into the boat, to go to the other side. Our eyewitness tells us that Jesus got in the boat just as he was. There was no popping home for a change of clothing or anything like that. Just as he was, he got into the boat. We're told, again, from eyewitnesses that there were other boats out on the Sea of Galilee within eyesight of their boat. We're told by somebody in the boat that the waves were breaking over the boat. Verses 36, the boat was nearly swamped. Again, helps us to get a bit of an idea. I don't know what sort of boat you're imagining. Presumably some sort of wooden thing with sails, but the water was coming over the sides. They were nearly swamped at this point, according to our eyewitness. Jesus, I knew I'd forget, so I'm glad I wrote this down, as our visual aid for today, was asleep on a cushion. Not just asleep in the boat, but asleep on a cushion, because the eyewitness saw the cushion under him. And then the words recorded in verse 38, "Teacher, Rabbi, don't you care if we drown?" It's worth saying that the Sea of Galilee was notorious for these storms then and now. Apparently, there are mountains that surround the Sea of Galilee on 3 sides, but not on the south side. The winds would come in from the southwest. These sort of furious squalls were familiar then and now. We know from chapter 1, verse 16, that people like Peter, Andrew, James and John, 4 of the fishermen in the boat with Jesus, that this Sea of Galilee is where they worked. Chapter 1, verse 16, that's where their boats were when Jesus called them. It was their usual stomping ground, and presumably they were familiar with all weathers. But this is severe. The boat is nearly swamped. And we know from verse 38, presumably with an element of panic in their voices, "Rabbi, teacher, don't you care if we drown?" that they, in some sense, are staring death in the face. They're in a familiar situation where normally they would have a degree of control, I presume, but they've now seen that situation spiralling out of control. We're not told about the tax collectors. It's only occurred to me this morning. I just picture them with a very green face, probably being sick over the side, having no clue. Sorry to the accountants in the room. Thought that'd make you look up, John. But, they must have been beyond terrified, mustn't they? It's not really their day job. But these fishermen, this situation of some familiarity has spiraled out of control. I presume behind the words of "Teacher, don't you care if we drown" is raw fear. Pit of the stomach we're perhaps used to in certain situations as fear grips. Maybe a lightheadedness in the moment of whatever situation we're facing, a heart pounding. We might know something of this sickening, debilitating feeling. But here they are. And this scenario really here in Mark 4, the first of 4, reminds us, I think, of the insecurity of living in a disordered world, especially a disordered natural world. That's the focus here with this storm. We know of wars, famines, earthquakes, tsunamis, storms, hurricanes, Hurricane Beryl. The news footage of people preparing, of bracing themselves, having some warning but knowing that the horror's coming. That is in a sense a snapshot, isn't it, of the world at different times in different places. The insecurity of living in a disordered, fallen world. But at the heart of this in verse 38 is that call, isn't it? Don't you care if we drown? I'd love more details. I so often find this in the Bible. I just wish we were told even more. Jesus is in activity, sleeping. I mean, again, that is just beggars belief, doesn't it? As they're trying to keep this boat afloat, Jesus is literally asleep in a cushion, on a cushion in the stern of the boat. What are they asking for, I wonder? Is it a case simply of all hands to the deck? We're trying to get the water. I don't know if that's what they were doing, trying to get the water out of the boat or what. Was it that, don't you care? We need every pair of hands. Was there something in the disciples at this stage that they've seen him make paralyzed legs work and leprosy leave a body? Are they hoping Jesus can do something to somehow get them to safety? We don't really know. But what we do know at this stage is that their greatest feeling, and this takes centre stage as the incident unfolds, their greatest feeling is fear. And it does make sense, doesn't it? We've got to say this. We've got to be kind of real about this. It makes sense that they would be afraid. It makes sense that life-threatening situations causes fear to rise. Missiles landing, hurricanes arriving, starvation setting in. Fear makes sense. Hospital results, declining health. They can induce fear. Any situation that we're in that spirals out of control can cause fear. One of the interesting things with Mark's Gospel is that the one who's sleeping in the boat, the one who's there on that cushion, Mark has already introduced to us readers. We know more than they know. If you've ever seen that episode of Friends, we know that they don't know that we know that they don't. We know more than the disciples know in that sense. Mark has started the gospel for us as readers, chapter 1, verse 1, saying that this is the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, God's anointed king. We know that this is God's king promised from long ago, who would be king of an eternal, everlasting kingdom. But in a sense, they're still beginning to sort of learn these things. Funny, isn't it? They address Jesus here as rabbi, teacher, for the first time. Well, what can this rabbi do? I don't know what you thought as Jemima read this, verse 39. Mark simply tells us in so few words, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Just in case you are new and didn't realise I didn't say much, but Isaac and Jenny have had a new baby, by the way. That's why they've been away and why Isaac's fingers are sore. Not because of the baby, no, because he hasn't played much guitar. Jesse was the name revealed. Well, I found myself in this scenario of likening Jesus to a parent stood in front two young children. One I've named Wind, the other Waves. And like a parent, Jesus seems to stand in front of these two children, speaks directly to them. Quiet, be still. And they obey him instantly. The wind stops like that, which is miracle number one. Now, as a skeptic, perhaps, in the room or reading Mark's Gospel, you may say, well, these furious squalls, they come out of nowhere. They're going to stop, aren't they? It could be that somehow there's just amazingly fluky timing. And if that were the case, the one thing that wouldn't happen is that the waves wouldn't go calm. So the scientists in the room presumably could underline this, certainly the ones I've read about do. When there's a storm and the waves are up and coming over the boat and all the rest of it, they don't stop instantly. It can take a day or two for the seas to calm down. Quiet, be still, and instantly the wind stops, and instantly the waves go calm. Now, how would you react if you were on that boat? I was thinking about this before last night's football, but not too long after the previous England game, when Jude Bellingham scored in about the 95th minute with 30 seconds from going out of the tournament. Now, how do you react when something like that happens? Well, the cameras just go immediately, don't they, to the crowd who are leaping and yelling. They go around the country, don't they, showing you in London and Manchester, all the celebrations, all the drinks go up in the air. That's what I would be feeling if we're just staring death in the face. You'd think the immediate thing would be rejoicing. And yet we're not told anything at this stage after Jesus' words and the complete calm settles. But Jesus is the next one to speak. And Jesus says to his disciples in verse 40, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Now that's actually quite probing, I think, when you think about it. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Jesus seems to be immediately using this opportunity to say to the disciples that if you knew who was asleep on the cushion, you would not have feared in the way that you did. They were understandably utterly consumed by the storm, but if they'd been consumed by him, they would not have feared. It's interesting, the miraculous powers of Jesus so far in Mark have pretty much the same reaction after them, and it's amazement. Chapter 1, 27-28, when Jesus drives out demons, we're told that they were amazed at what they'd seen, amazed at his authority. After the paralysed man that we were thinking about at Messy Church received the use of his legs and stood up and walked out and praised God, the reaction was amazement. And yet the reaction to the stilling of the storm, don't miss this in verse 41, is not amazement that we're told about, not celebration. The reaction when they see what Jesus does is terror. Verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. We see that again, just Mark sort of takes us into the minds and lives of these disciples, that absolute 100% red flashing light fear of the storm is replaced by terror. And the whole reason for that terror is whose presence are they in? And not sure that any of them immediately thought about the book of Psalms, but it's the same thing in terms of what was happening, I think, in their minds. If they had thought about the Psalms, they might have gone to these words in Psalm 65. Speaking of God, you answer us with awesome and righteous deeds, God our Saviour, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength, who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves. Or Psalm 89, a little bit further on in the book of Psalms. These words. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging seas. When their waves mount up, you still them. I'm sure those references didn't come to mind of these disciples, but they knew, as faithful Jews, that the mountains surrounding the Sea of Galilee were put there by God, that the sea was put there by God, and that God alone is the one with the power to still the waves and to still a storm and to control his own creation. At this moment, the disciples know that they are in the presence of, whose presence are they in? No human being can do this. If you ever do Christianity Explored, you'll hear Rico Tice, as he's going through Mark's Gospel, talk about giving this a go in the bath. And every time I hear him mention it, I think of Henry when he was really little. He used to love sitting on the top of the bath and sliding down the slope into the bath. I mean, just loved it. You could hear him. You could hear the noise, the joy. And then if you're there, you see the water beginning to go. Don't tell the church deacons. I mean, it was someone on the floor. This was storm territory when Henry was on the loose in the bath. Rico Tice says, have a go. Stand up. Talk to the wave. Tell it to calm. No one can do this. Jesus' actions here caused terror to his disciples because of the implication. What on earth are they seeing? Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. The implication is that the one who created the heavens and the earth is here asleep on this cushion. Just as he spoke the waters into existence, now they obey his every word. That's the conclusion. But can that be? Can that possibly be? Let's just go to the last slide. These three. What does this incident teach us about Jesus? Well, it teaches us something about his identity. Who alone can do this but God? It shows us something of the extent of his power and authority, that nature and the created order literally obey the words from Jesus' mouth. We see a foretaste of his kingdom, this unruly, post-Eden, fallen creation, in this incident is restored perfectly, which is a picture of the restored Eden to come, of his kingdom to come, of a new heaven and a new earth. And in all of these things, and you'll see this more and more as we go through the next thing, you might ask the question, where's the God of this age? Where's the ruler and the prince of the air? Well, you'll find him firmly under the foot of the Son of God. But finally, fourthly here, we see this interplay between faith and fear. Faith in him will begin to drive out fear. So we ask, and it's not a very great parallel really, but what challenges are we currently facing? What are the things that we are currently afraid of? Where is it that we feel out of our depth? Where is it that things are spiraling out of control? Where is it that fear appears sensible, but doesn't account for the fact, as we began this service this morning, that you have been redeemed by the one who stood in this boat, that you are his. Jesus ends Matthew's gospel with these words, I am with you always to the very end of the age. And those that he spoke those words to are no longer here, but this age is continuing. So presumably they hold for all of his people, I am with you always to the very end of the age. And just before he said those words to his disciples, he said these words, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He speaks to the wind and it obeys. He speaks to the waves and they obey. I am with you always to the very end of the age. What decisions do we have to make where we perhaps fear their consequences? What situations are we heading into that we might fear? What people do we have to deal with that we might fear? What are our fears and worries and concerns as parents for our children? I am with you always to the very end of the age. We're concerned about our role as ambassadors, sowers of the seed, worried about opposition, fear of people, our school friends, persecution. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? There's a journey these disciples are going to go on. I don't quite know why there's a missing pom-pom, is that what it's called? Thanks, Sarah. It's as if as we go through Mark for these disciples, in the early chapters, imagine there's no pom-poms. After the first few healings and driving out of demons and so on, it's as if Jesus pops a pom-pom onto their faith. They're then in a boat with Jesus and facing death right in front of them. Why are you still afraid? Why do you still not have any faith? I think after chapters 4 and 5 and Jesus wrestling with nature, evil, sickness, death, the disciples come out of this section, I think, with another pom-pom on in terms of their faith. The second half of Mark will particularly focus on Jesus nurturing and growing and strengthening their faith. At the cross, they're still slightly wobbly, aren't they? Not really sure what's going on, scattering for fear. After the resurrection and the risen Jesus and touching him and seeing where the nails were, but knowing that he's alive as he eats with them, is another pom-pom or strength onto their faith. And then on the day of Pentecost, as we were singing earlier on, the Spirit of the living God fell upon them. And the fourth pom-pom, as it were, is added. And they're still growing and learning and growing in faith then as they follow him and go about his mission. But they will face literal storms and shipwreck and beatings and imprisonment and all sorts of persecution. And they will die for him. Fear has been driven out and replaced by faith. I am with you always to the very end of the age. Don't look at the storm, look at me. And as I say, it's not the greatest of things, I don't think, to sort of think about our little storms of life or big storms of life and compare it to this big storm. Something a bit other than that going on. But in a sense, the principles are still there. It'll be different for all of us at the moment, but I think the sort of thing I want to stress now, and I am finishing, is that in the storms, and there is no promise in this passage that Jesus will remove every one of our storms. I've just listed the storms the disciples have gone through. But the King of all creation is with you in the storm. He may do a miracle and change the storm, but if he doesn't, he is still with you. The message, it seems here to his disciples, is put your hand in his, seek him in the storm, and he will never leave you. Put your hand into the hands that bore nails for you. Put your faith in him.